So yeah, just I guess to contextualise the paper that I'm presenting today. So it's something I've developed, a paper for a special edition of the journal Public Health Ethics, and it's looking at public mental health ethics. So I'll talk a bit about that more during the presentation. But the paper is very much grounded in the Australian context, which is important, having spoken to a few people last night from the UK. So, and in Australia, last year there's an organisation affiliated with the University of New South Wales called the Black Dog Institute, and it's also a centre for research excellence in suicide prevention. And they were awarded about $14 million in private funding to develop a systems approach to suicide prevention. And as a result, they've got significant sort of political clout in developing suicide prevention policy in Australia. And I've sort of taken some of that out of this sort of paper, but essentially it's a sort of multi-component strategy, similar to the European Alliance for Depression, that sort of four-pronged sort of strategy, but this one's sort of 9, but generally using many of the things that are already being used. So gatekeeper training, restriction to lethal means, education programs, good, clinical care for people who have made a suicide attempt, and follow-up. And there's sort of quite a specious argument involved in it, because it's generally that there's not really good evidence for a lot of those things working, but somehow together they seem to work. So, but one of the main things that I took, umbrage with was that it deliberately sort of eschews any reference to the social determinants of health. So I wanted to write a conversation, a piece for the conversation, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. So it's an online sort of a journal that publishes, work from academics, but for readership largely non-academic. And I think I wrote something, and as well as being criticised for my academic language, so I'm obviously thoroughly institutionalised and can't change that. But it was also like, we're sort of we've published something like that recently, and we're getting a bit tired of all of these motherhood kind of statements about the importance of the social factors. So I was a bit sort of taken by that. But I guess also the point that Ian was sort of saying that, it has sort of become this platitude that we're arguing for the importance of sort of social factors, and everyone's sort of saying it, but what does that really mean, and how can we sort of affect that sort of political change? So I wanted to come up with, some kind of strategy or practical mechanism for creating sort of, action to change the sort of social determinants. And I'm not quite sure, I sort of probably differ a bit from Mark's perspective, because we seem to have really good evidence for the social determinants of health. Michael Marmot's report, the World Health Organization also published on the social determinants of suicide. So there is actually really good evidence out there for changing the social determinants of health. Yet nothing seems to happen. And so I'm actually interested in that idea of what role sort of ethics and providing a sort of an ethical argument or ethical justification for change, what that might sort of look like. And this sort of paper's, developed around that idea. So, and it's very much sort of a theoretical one, and I'm not quite sure whether I really pull it off. So, take it easy on me at the end. So, okay. So, in some ways, critical discussion about ethics, what it is and does, sort of parallels intellectual debates in other fields like suicidology. So in the Anglo-American or analytic tradition of moral philosophy, the project of doing ethics is commonly associated with the sort of systematic endeavour to understand moral concepts and to justify moral principles and theories. This sort of view of ethics as an isolable body of theory has been criticised for fostering an abstract and impersonal picture of moral knowledge and experiences that's not really an accurate reflection of human moral life. So ethics is not a purely technical matter. It's also practical and involves deeper questions about meaningful engagement, value, human flourishing. So recognising the difficulties inherent in moral philosophical approaches, feminist, narrative and anthropological approaches, among others, have been developed. And these provide really valuable and additional sources of moral reflection and analysis. And I guess in many ways this sort of problematising of ethics has been the touchstone for much of my own work. And I guess one of the aims of my larger research project, as I see it, is to broaden our conceptualizations of the ethical domain in suicidology. So traditionally, ethical discussion on suicide has focused on the philosophical and moral arguments on the morality of suicide, of which an extensive body really exists in both Western and non-Western traditions. So issues typically discussed are the individual right to suicide, the rationality of the act, and the harms and benefits of suicide to individuals and communities. So despite the ongoing relevance of these issues, for most of the 20th and well into the 21st century, ethical discussion of suicide, at least in the West, has really been sort of consigned to the margins of suicidology. So with the exception of debate over assisted suicide, suicide is almost universally seen as a problem requiring prevention. And this impetus for suicide prevention, I guess, is viewed as ethically unproblematic, as it sort of reflects the moral sentiments and progressive values of contemporary Western societies to sort of ameliorate harm and suffering among its citizens. This claim is made even more persuasive by the commonly held view that suicide is almost always seen as the result of distorted thought processes or mental illness. So given the primacy of biomedicine in suicidology, it follows that ethical issues have been discussed primarily from a mental health or a clinical perspective. So discussion therefore tends to focus on the use of coercive, invasive or emergency interventions, with a primary concern being with the interests and values of individuals. For example, concepts typically drawn on include rationality, paternalism, autonomy and professional duty. But in addition to being a mental health issue, suicide is obviously also a public health issue. But what do we kind of mean by saying suicide is a public health issue? Well, according to Dawson and Silver, a public health issue is not just one that can be measured at the population level. And it's not just a common issue, but rather it's one with specific causes that go beyond individual choices and desires. So recent work in public health ethics has critiqued the dominant liberal and individualist bioethics frameworks typically used to examine public health issues. So the focus on individual autonomy, rights and duties that underpin these approaches are considered sort of ill-suited for the ethics of public health, where concerns with collective goods are of greater importance. So what these works hold in common is the view that health is significantly different when considered from a public health as opposed to a clinical perspective. So the three key points I'd just like to touch on in establishing suicide as a public health issue. So first, because many of the causes of suicide extend beyond the individual to the collective level, for example, unemployment, social isolation, severe and persistent mental illness, and relate to membership of various groups and communities, for example, the Indigenous, LGBTI, those in the criminal justice system, then it can also be addressed through population-based preventive strategies. Second, public health activity is directed towards preventing and reducing harm at a population level. So essential treatment, which sort of underpins many sort of so-called population-based strategies such as education and awareness programs, should not be conflated with suicide prevention as a public health intervention. Third, the context in which people live their lives may limit or expand the opportunities for them to be healthy and to make decisions about their health. Because such action mainly occurs at a social and political level, ethical justification for it can be especially demanding. So I guess one of the recent tasks of recent work in public health ethics has been to develop sort of conceptual and analytic frameworks able to capture the distinct moral features of public health practice in order to guide action at a social and political level. So these frameworks are really important because numerous local and national suicide prevention strategies promote ethically relevant concepts such as equality, responsibility, social justice, vulnerability and care. Yet rarely are they defined in sort of any detail or with reference to existing ethical theory or empirical evidence. So indeed, one of the central problems as I see it in current suicide prevention policy and practice is the sort of conceptual vagueness regarding the ethical basis for decisions. So this includes issues relating to the prioritisation of problems, the allocation of resources, the translation of research into practice, as well as conceptualisations of risk and responsibility for suicide and its prevention. So given this work is still very much in its early stages, I'm not going to provide a comprehensive ethical analysis of all of those issues. Rather, inspired by recent analyses of responsibilisation, I'd just like to examine how different forms of responsibility are sort of envisioned and enacted within current suicide prevention practice, the ethical implications of this, and how we might think about responding to them. So responsibility for suicide prevention cuts across multiple domains. So this includes the suicidal or recently suicidal person's responsibility to him or herself and to others to, minimise risk by seeking help and complying with treatment recommendations. Other forms of responsibility are evident in policy documents and interventions directed at families, schools, sporting clubs, workplaces and the media. So these broadly stipulate the The importance of community ownership and responsibility for suicide and its prevention. Although what this means in practice is not really exactly clear. In most cases, it seems to be used as to establish the foundation for establishing suicide prevention activities, so namely education, gatekeeper training and responsible media reporting across the whole of community. Responsibility is also attributed to professionals and institutions who have a significant duty in caring for persons who are suicidal. Another form of responsibility is that taken up by mental health and suicide prevention organisations, and involved in education, health promotion and advocacy. Responsibility for suicide prevention is also assumed by local, federal and state governments who oversee funding commitments and specific policy directions. So practices of care, as many of you know, working in the field, are enacted through intimate face-to-face relationships and between collectivities. And the above practices certainly do not preclude the provision of effective and compassionate care. My focus here is not on specific care practices per se, but rather how certain kinds of responsibility are nourished and legitimated by these practices and in dialogical relationship with sort of liberal democratic values, goals and orientations. So notions of building individual and community strength, resilience and capacity, so often evident in suicide prevention policy, illustrate how ideals of responsibility are enmeshed within a set of broader moral, social and economic practices shaping contemporary social relations. So this is from the Australian framework of suicide prevention, but I know it's probably familiar to many of you. One of the main aims of suicide prevention activities is to build resilience in individuals, their families and in whole communities, to increase their capacity to respond to life's events, whatever they may be. Resilience is the ability to bounce back after experiencing trauma or stress, to adapt to changing circumstances and respond positively to difficult situations. It is the ability to learn and grow through the positive and the negative experiences of life, turning potentially traumatic experiences into constructive ones. Being resilient involves engaging with friends and family for support and using coping strategies and problem-solving skills effectively to work through difficulties. So while not discounting the need for resilience approaches, we should be cautious of their positions of dominance within the suicide prevention field. As David Harper and Ewan Speed have argued, despite the often optimistic rhetoric that surrounds them, resilience discourses are conceptually dependent on individualistic notions of strength and weakness for them to make sense. And this does little to challenge dominant deficit models of psychological distress and ascriptions of individual responsibility. Processes of individualisation and responsibilisation have been linked to neoliberal ideals, including a decline in government spending on the health and well-being of citizens, and a strong bias toward understanding principal mental health challenges as individual rather than societal. So broadly put, responsibilisation refers to a technique of governance that expects and assumes certain moral capacities and duties to one's care. As Ronan Shamir writes, in order to be effective, responsibilisation operates at the level of individual actors, reconfiguring roles and identities so as to mobilise designated actors actively to undertake and perform self-governing tasks. So here we might think of the numerous sort of health-promoting behaviours people are expected to undertake within resilience approaches. The problem-solving, the coping strategies, the positive engagement, the self-improvement. A good example of this and how uneven and conflicting relations of responsibility can impose additional harms and burdens on individuals and community is the issue of farmer suicide. As the work of China, Daniel Münster and others has shown, farmer suicide in India has become increasingly politicised, with increasing high rates of suicide in some regions coming to symbolise, to a greater or lesser extent, a precarious agrarian existence in the face of industrial modernisation, neoliberal reform, and the failure of the nation state to protect its agrarian community. While this has inspired farmers to activism and collective action, and led to the introduction of general programs aimed at ameliorating debt and generating employment for rural workers, the extent and justification of state and corporate responsibility is contested. As China has documented in her work Decolonising Global Mental Health, recognition of the socio-political and economic determinants of suicide does not necessarily translate into structural change at the state level. In Australia, environmental and political issues affecting farmers' health and well-being, such as drought, agricultural subsidies and land and water use and management, have been considered almost exclusively through a mental health lens. Again, the solutions put forward operate primarily at the individual level. For For example, one of the priorities of the New South Wales Farmers' Mental Health Blueprint is to enhance the resilience of individuals and communities, to manage the pressures of life and work on the farm. Attempts to responsibilise farming communities are evident in discourses and practices that not only encourage individuals to access appropriate welfare, social and mental health support, but that emphasise the importance of management skills development. Farmers are urged to calculate the potential risks of business pressures on their health and to consider other options such as capital investment, more efficient practices, or to simply walk off the land. Some farmers, however, have interpreted these moves towards responsibilisation as unjust. A recent study of wine grape growers by Leah Bryant and Bridget Garnham from the University of South Australia highlighted the perceived injustices experienced by farmers as a result of state and corporate intervention in the wine industry. Perceptions of injustice were the potential basis for distress, but also for expressions of moral outrage at the violation of loyalty, trust and relations between grape growers, wineries and the state. Emotions of shame and guilt were common to farmers' experiences of psychological distress and closely bound with perceptions of self-worth, masculinity and personal responsibility. However, farmers also blamed their troubles on the government's dismantling of legislation that had previously supported farming families and that undermined decades of hard work and investment in return for a quick profit. Drawing on notions of mutual obligation and distributive justice, farmers in the study perceived these transgressions and the ensuing lack of care shown them to be a clear breach of social, corporate and ethical responsibility. In this context, efforts to impose responsibility on farmers to manage risk and to make sound choices with regards to their mental health and business decisions was seen to constitute a form of abandonment by government. So the need to enlarge our current ways of talking about suicide in order to find productive ways to discuss the harms caused by structural processes and the obligations of the state and other organisations to address them is clearly important. The concept of structural violence is useful here as it provides a means for articulating the often pernicious structural processes that impact upon human lives and that are so complex, multi-layered and diffuse as to make ascriptions of responsibility difficult. Because the concept of structural violence emphasises the systematic inequalities that impact mental health, it provides an opportunity to enlarge the prevailing moral and political discourse of suicide prevention to focus on important issues of rights and justice. But an appeal to abstract and universal propositions of rights, justice and obligation is not on its own sufficient. Arguments must appeal concretely and specifically to people's lived experience within various practices, such as those highlighted in Bryant and Garnham's study of wine grape growers. Arguments must also occur in conjunction with critical interpretation and reinterpretation of political institutions and action, and methods for appraising particular policies or decisions. So such an analysis suggests that promoting government receptivity to the social and political determinants of suicide is necessary. So in the final part of my presentation, I'd just like to examine one way that public health researchers, advocates and practitioners might go about doing this. So a number of strategies have been proposed as a way of enhancing whole of government systems to address the social determinants of health. One well-established practical mechanism with an explicit health focus is health impact assessment, or HIA. Originally developed in response to concerns about the impact of the physical environment on health, HIAs have become increasingly part of legislative and regulatory requirements in Australia, aimed at minimising the potential health impacts of major projects in transport, housing and community development. More recently, the field of public health has identified HIA as an important mechanism to assess the potential health consequences of policies and programs from non-health sectors in line with the social view of health. Despite increasing uses of HIA, there is considerable diversity in practice, and evidence of effectiveness depends on the salience of different factors for HIA participants. Different forms of HIA, for example, draw on different conceptualisations of health, employ different epistemological and methodological perspectives, and serve markedly different purposes. So three of these with particular relevance for this work are decision support HIAs, advocacy HIAs, and community-led HIAs. So drawing on the work of Elizabeth Harris and Ben Harris-Roxas from the University of New South Wales, I'd just like to provide a brief overview of these three models and discuss their relevance for including the whole of government and whole of community in efforts to improve action on the social determinants of suicide. Decision support HIA seek to improve decision making and implementation of policies in order to minimise negative health impacts and maximise positive health impacts. They are normally conducted by or with the agreement of the agency responsible for the policy. Ideally, decision support HIAs should be undertaken before a policy has been developed in order to enable analysis of the policy planning activity much earlier in the cycle. But given the lack of clarity about the role of government and their capacity to undertake HIAs, this is often not the case. In contrast to decision support HIAs, advocacy HIAs are undertaken by groups or organisations who are not directly involved in the policy making process, but who seek to influence the design and implementation of policy. In particular, advocacy HIAs seek to broaden the scope of the policy making process in order for unexamined health consequences to be addressed, especially in those cases where the views of those most likely to be impacted by a specific policy are underrepresented. Advocacy HIAs are thus an important tool for addressing the potential health inequities of a policy across populations and involve a clear articulation of values in relation to both evidence and ethics. A more explicit role for values and value judgments can also be found in community-led HIAs, where the community directly undertakes the HIA process itself, again usually in response to a specific policy, and where community values play an important role in evaluating evidence and impacts. So the effectiveness of HIAs in altering the social determinants of health is still unclear, although there are numerous examples of them influencing decision making, to include greater consideration of the social determinants of health in non-health sectors. In the absence of community-based research that assesses the impacts of policies and programs on health and well-being, advocacy and community-led HIAs may enable greater assessment of the needs of communities and groups impacted by specific policies and programs, and for them to take a more proactive role in the political process of policy making. They may also have the effect of forcing mental health and suicide researchers to examine the methodological biases in their own research and to find new, creative and above all practical ways to address the current gaps in evidence. The important role of advocacy and community-led HIAs in identifying and articulating cultural norms and values can also result in significant social learning as community groups and organisations develop a more nuanced understanding of a problem and the competing norms and values that underpin alternative positions. The emphasis on dialogue and increased interaction that is a feature of social learning in the HIA process may therefore result in more productive relations between decision makers, community groups and organisations in a bid to identify and realise shared societal goals. Just another minute or two. We have 30 minutes or...
Yeah, it depends if you want some questions.
It's over 30 minutes.
Yeah, no, it's fine. You're fine.
Oh, no, sorry. I thought it was, I timed it at 23 minutes.
Okay.
It was just over 20.
We've about 5 minutes left, so it's up to you.
Okay.
That's thrown you now, isn't it?
It threw me when you first did it because I timed it at 23. So look, I mean, that's sort of the gist of it, I guess. Like at the end, I just get, I guess, very prescriptive about, ways that we can, we can sort of, I guess, seek to build capacity for social determinants action. But yeah, sorry.
No, thanks.
I always speak so fast. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Can I invite you?